Smoke covered the battlefield like a dark sea and fire burned along. The broken steel of fallen machines and ruined towers. The sound of distant blasts echoed across the valley, and above it all the sky remained a red blur from constant laser fire. And missile trails, the air was thick with heat, dust, and death, and the earth trembled. Beneath the weight of destruction, in the center of the chaos among crushed tanks and scorched bodies, stood a tall warrior, her armor cracked, her blade stained. With blood, her breathing heavy yet fierce, her name was Riva, and among her people she was feared as the strongest fighter. Ever born, bred for war, trained to kill, raised without fear, she had never known mercy and never expected to receive it. But even she knew that the tide had turned, and this time her strength would not be enough. Enemy forces surged like a tidal wave, 1,000 machines marching through the dust with glowing eyes and smoking cannons. Her comrades had already retreated. They had no choice. The orders were clear. The enemy had outflanked them, and their position had become a death trap. Yet Riva refused to run. She stayed behind to cover their escape, cutting down wave after wave, until her energy began to fade, and her knees began to tremble. Her final blow took down a giant mech, but its wreckage crashed into her side, throwing her across the dirt. Her shoulder shattered, her weapon flew from her hand, her vision blurred as she hit the ground and pain shot through her chest. She tried to rise, but her legs would not obey. Her lungs gasped for air, her world spun and darkened, and the last thing she saw was the enemy closing in, their weapons raised, ready to finish what they had started. From a ridge above the battle, a human soldier watched through cracked goggles. His name was Daniel, and he had fought too long and seen too much. He was not a commander or a hero. He was a survivor, one of the few humans still left on this front. The alliance between species had grown weak. Most had fled, but Daniel remained because of a promise he had made to his fallen unit, that he would not leave others behind no matter the cost. Through the smoke he saw her fall. He saw the way she tried to rise again, only to collapse. And he saw the enemy approaching her position, like vultures circling a wounded beast. He could have turned away. No one would have blamed him. She was not human, and the area was crawling with death. But something in the way she fought, something in her refusal to surrender, stirred something deep inside him, and before he could think twice, his feet were already moving. Daniel ran through the fire and rubble, past corpses and wrecked machines. Bullets zipped past his head and explosions lit up the sky around him, but he kept running, his heart pounding, his breath sharp with every step. He got closer to the fallen warrior, until finally he reached her, body crumpled in the dirt, her face half hidden by her helmet, her breathing shallow and broken. He dropped beside her and gently turned her over. Her eyes flickered open for a second, golden and fierce. Even in pain she looked at him with confusion. Her lips moved, speaking a language he could not fully understand, but the tone was clear. Surprise, disbelief, and then silence as she passed out again. Daniel checked her pulse, weak, but there he had no stretcher, no backup. Just a few supplies and a fading beacon signal. But he knew he couldn't leave her here. He pulled her arm over his shoulder, gritted his teeth, and started to drag her body away from the enemy line. Every step felt like lifting a mountain. She was tall and heavy, her armor thick and sharp. But Daniel did not stop, not even when gunfire echoed behind him, through broken alleys and collapsed bunkers. He moved, carrying her weight like a burden and a mission. At the same time, he could feel the heat of pursuit behind him, sensors buzzing, machines scanning, and patrols closing in. But he kept going, weaving through wreckage and ducking beneath fallen beams, until at last he reached an old maintenance tunnel, half collapsed and long forgotten. It was just wide enough for him to crawl through with her. Inside the tunnel, the light was dim and the air was stale, but it was shelter. He laid her down, gently checked her wounds, and applied a foam seal to stop the worst of the bleeding. Her body trembled, and she groaned softly, eyes fluttering open again. She looked at him, really looked at him this time, and for a long moment they stared at each other, human and alien, both broken, both exhausted but still breathing. Daniel gave her a small nod as if to say, "You're safe now," and in return, she whispered something barely audible and closed her eyes again. Not in death, In rest, the danger was not over, the enemy was still near, and the way forward uncertain, but for now in this dark, forgotten tunnel a human had done what no one else dared. He had crossed the battlefield for someone not his own, and in doing so had changed everything. Outside the tunnel the wind howled, the battle raged, and the stars above flickered in a blood-red sky. But deep in the dark beneath the broken world, two souls had just taken the first step toward something neither of them could yet understand. The silence in the tunnel was broken only by the slow, uneven breathing of the alien warrior and the soft crunch of Daniel's boots as he moved back and forth, checking corners, listening for signs of pursuit, and adjusting the small light on his wrist that barely lit the path ahead. The walls were cracked and coated in dust, old wires hung from the ceiling, and the air smelled like rust and ash, but this place was hidden for now. It was safe. Riva lay still, her breathing shallow but steady, her armor broken, her skin marked with burns and bruises, her hands curled into fists even in unconsciousness. Daniel knelt beside her and checked her wounds again. The foam had slowed the bleeding, but infection was a real danger. His supplies were low and time was short. The enemy would not stop searching, and he could not stay here long. But leaving her alone, even for a minute, felt wrong. He had seen her fight with the fury of a storm, one warrior standing against a tide of machines, and fire, her sword flashing, her eyes glowing fierce and proud. And yet when she fell, there was no one, not even her own people, who came for her. It reminded him of another time long ago, when his own unit had fallen ambushed, betrayed, left behind. He was the only one who crawled out alive, and he had carried that memory like a scar ever since. He reached into his pack, pulled out a hydration tab, and gently placed it near her lips. Her mouth moved weakly, instinct guiding her to swallow the small amount of water, and then she coughed. Her eyes fluttered open again, not as wild as before, now filled with pain and confusion. She looked around, trying to move, but her body refused. Daniel held her shoulder firm, but gentle, told her to rest, that she was safe for now, even if she didn't understand his words. His voice was calm, steady, a shield in the darkness. She watched him silently, eyes tracing his face, his armor, his hands, and then something shifted in her gaze. A question perhaps, or maybe a memory. Whatever it was, she blinked once, slow and heavy, then turned her head and looked away as if trying to hide her weakness. Daniel didn't press her. Instead, he leaned back, scanned the tunnel again, and began to plan. He pulled out an old map scanner, barely working, and searched for exits, paths, supply points, anything useful. The nearest friendly zone was too far. Days of travel through dangerous terrain, no transports, no beacons, no hope of extraction. But there was a maintenance outpost marked just outside the city ruins, maybe still standing, maybe not. But it was the only chance they had. He turned back to her, spoke softly, and pointed to the direction they needed to go. She didn't reply, but her eyes followed his finger, and then slowly she gave a nod. Her strength was not enough to walk, not yet, so Daniel prepared to move her again. He fashioned a makeshift harness from broken straps, and used parts of his gear to support her weight. It was not perfect, but it would have to do. As he lifted her once more, her body slumped against him, heavy but not lifeless. Her hand brushed against his side, fingers twitching like a reflex. Maybe trust, maybe habit. Either way, he began the long, slow journey through the tunnels, every step echoing in the narrow space, every corner turned with caution, every shadow watched with sharp eyes. Above them, the enemy searched ruins, scanning wreckage, sending patrols through broken streets. But below, in the veins of the dead city, two lives moved through darkness, bound not by orders or allegiance, but by choice and survival, and something deeper that neither of them yet understood. Hours passed, the tunnel twisted and turned. Debris blocked their path in places, and Daniel had to crawl, dragging her carefully behind him. Sweat soaked his back, his arms ached, but he never stopped, not once. Sometimes she would murmur words in her language, soft and broken. Sometimes she would stir and grip his shoulder in pain, but she never cried out, and he never let her fall. At last they reached a small chamber where old lights flickered weakly, and the air felt slightly cleaner. Daniel set her down against the wall, gave her water and some rations, and then checked the sealed door that led upward to the ruins above. Still locked, still strong, he sat beside her, breathing hard, watching the door and listening to the silence beyond. She turned her head slowly, looked at him again, and this time she spoke not in her language, but in a rough attempt at his human words. Her voice cracked low, unsure, but clear enough. She asked why he had come, why he had risked everything for her. Why a human would care about an alien warrior left behind. Daniel looked at her and didn't answer right away. He thought about his old squad, the battles, the blood, the betrayal. He thought about all the times he had been told to follow orders, to look the other way, to leave the weak behind. He thought about the promise he had made and the weight it still carried. Even now then he looked at her and simply said, because no one else would. She stared at him for a long time, the fire in her eyes dimmed but not gone. Something inside her shifted, not fully understood, but real. A warrior who had never known mercy now saw it with her own eyes, and for the first time in her life she felt something strange, not shame, not pride, but something quieter, something close to respect. The lights flickered again. The air grew colder and distant sounds echoed through the pipes. The enemy was still searching, still hunting, and their time was running out. But for now, in this small, forgotten place, two warriors sat together, not as enemies, not yet as allies, but as something in between. Their journey was far from over. The danger still waited ahead, but something had begun, a bond forged, not in words, but in action, in pain and in choice, and neither of them could yet see where it would lead. The wind above howled through the ruined city like a restless ghost, while deep beneath the surface, inside that broken tunnel, the human and the alien warrior sat in heavy silence. The dim flickering lights cast long shadows across their faces, their bodies tired, their minds alert. And though the air was cold, there was something slowly beginning to warm between them, something unspoken that neither could fully explain. Riva's breathing had steadied her wounds sealed as best as possible, her strength still far from whole, yet her eyes burned with the will to move again, to rise and fight and survive. She had spent her life in the discipline of war, raised in a world where weakness was punished and mercy was seen as failure. Her victories had brought honor and fear, but never trust, never companionship. And now here sat a human, one of the weaker species, or so she had been taught, who had carried her through fire and blood without asking for anything in return. Daniel rested with his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the entrance, his weapon across his lap. He had not slept more than minutes at a time. Every sound made his fingers tighten. Every vibration in the walls sent his mind racing. He had lost too much in this war, seen too many lives thrown away by generals who spoke of sacrifice and strategy, while never stepping into the mud and the blood and the wreckage where real soldiers bled. They had eaten little, shared water in silence. And when Riva finally spoke again, her voice was calmer, softer, her words still broken, but clear enough. She asked what kind of soldier he was, what mission he followed, what orders had sent him into the fire to save an enemy warrior, and Daniel gave a quiet chuckle, not one of joy but of dry, tired truth, and told her he had no orders, no mission. He had been left behind just like her. Her eyes narrowed, unsure if she should believe him, but something in his tone told her he was not lying. He spoke of a squad long gone, of friends lost in a failed assault, of commanders who never sent rescue, of signals ignored and screams unanswered. He had been forgotten and had survived alone, driven not by duty, but by something older, something deeper, a belief that even in war some things should not be abandoned. She asked him why he still fought, what was left worth saving, and his answer was not grand or poetic. He said because if people like him stopped fighting, then everything would burn, because someone had to carry others when they could not walk, and because if he left her there, then he would not be able to look at his own reflection. Without shame, Riva looked away, not because she did not understand, but because she did, and that understanding unsettled her. She had been taught to see strength only in dominance, and now here was a man broken and scarred with no command. No backup, no rank, and yet more powerful than many of the so-called champions she had once served beside. Hours passed. The tunnel quiet around them. Daniel patched a crack in the ceiling to keep moisture from dripping. He adjusted the signal scrambler to mask their heat signature and checked the outpost location again. It was still their best chance, but reaching. It would not be easy. They would have to cross part of the open zone. A burned-out wasteland watched by enemy drones and crawling with scavenger bots that stripped flesh from bone in minutes, explained the route to her drawing lines on the dirt. With a broken wire she listened closely, her mind already forming battle plans. Even weakened, she thought like a warrior, mapping movements, imagining attacks, visualizing the field. And when she spoke again, it was not to protest the danger, but to offer tactics, faster paths, possible ambush points. She would walk again, not out of pride, but because she refused to slow them down. Daniel helped her stand, her legs shaky, her breath short, but she stood with his support, her arm over his shoulder. Her steps slow but steady, they moved again through the tunnel, deeper into the forgotten infrastructure of the ruined city, past collapsed pipes, rusted metal, and ancient systems. Long dead above them, the machines of war searched for survivors, but below, two souls moved like ghosts, driven not by orders, but by a shared will to survive. There were moments where she stumbled, and he caught her, moments where he faltered, and she steadied him. Their movements awkward, but growing more fluid with each step. Two fighters learning each other's rhythm without words. When they reached a broken maintenance shaft too narrow to walk through, she insisted he go first, then followed on her hands and knees, biting back pain and never once asking to stop. As they emerged into a side chamber filled with old crates and shattered tools, Daniel paused, motioned for silence, and pointed upward through a hole in the ceiling. Voices static, the sound of metal feet moving, enemy patrols. Scanning above, he looked at her eyes, asking what to do, and she signaled to wait, then drew a broken pipe from the floor and handed it to him, a silent plan forming between them. When the sound faded, they climbed through the hole, emerging into the shell of a collapsed building. Smoke and ash everywhere, the wind bitter, the sky covered in thick clouds of war. The city stretched in every direction, a graveyard of steel and stone. But there in the distance, just beyond the broken towers, lay the outline of the outpost, their goal still intact, if only just. They moved between shadows, keeping low, using debris and rubble as cover, and when a drone passed overhead, Riva reached up with a sharp shard of metal and pulled it from the sky with silent precision. Daniel watched her work, fast, efficient, brutal, and in that moment he realized she was not just strong, she was deadly and focused. And now, for the first time, not fighting alone, they rested again in the shell of an old transport, watching the smoke rise from the distant battlefield. She looked at him then and asked a single question: would he have done the same for any other? And his answer was simple: maybe, but not like this. And she nodded, not smiling, not speaking, but understanding. The bond between them was no longer just survival, no longer just a temporary alliance. It was becoming something stronger, something forged in pain and trust, and the slow realization that though they came from different worlds, they were walking the same path, now not as enemies, not even as strangers, but as two fighters who had found in each other what their own people had forgotten. The morning sky was not blue, but covered with ash and smoke that turned the light into a dull glow, casting a sickly orange across the ruins. The city lay still, as if the war had finally drained the last breath from its hollow chest towers. Once proud, now leaned like tired giants, windows broken, steel frames twisted, and the silence was not peace, but warning, a silence that waited for something to happen again. Daniel and Riva stood near the edge of a broken wall, their bodies pressed close against the surface, as they watched the enemy patrol pass through the street. Below, the machines moved in perfect rhythm, their sensors sweeping left and right, each step pounding against the cracked concrete like a slow heartbeat. And though they were close, the two remained hidden, masked by dust, shadow, and the cold signal scrambler Daniel carried on his belt. Riva's breathing was deeper now, stronger, though not yet full. Her wounds had begun to close, but the pain still clung to her like a second skin. Yet she did not speak of it, nor complain, nor ask for rest. Her focus was forward, always scanning, always judging every angle, every opening, like a true warrior who knew that hesitation cost lives. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the path ahead. Then she turned to Daniel and gave a short nod. It was time. The outpost they had been walking toward stood just beyond the fallen bridge, a structure built into the side of a ridge, half buried by rubble, but its signal still flickered faintly. A place that once served as a repair station for scouts and runners, now forgotten, left to rust and sink into the ground. But if the power core was still working, it could give them shelter, maybe medical supplies, maybe a chance to contact a neutral zone, or even a rescue party. They crossed the street like shadows, avoiding the patrols, moving quickly between cover, always silent, always alert. At one point, a drone flew low, too close, its lights scanning the area, and Daniel pressed Riva down beneath a broken beam, his arm across her shoulders, her hand gripping her blade. But the drone passed without pause, and they breathed again together, one heartbeat, two minds working as one. At last they reached the base of the outpost and found the entrance buried under debris, metal beams and concrete, but not beyond clearing. Together they pulled and pushed, lifting the pieces with effort, sweat covering their skin, breath rough, and hands bleeding. But they cleared enough to open the door, a heavy mechanical hatch that groaned as it moved, revealing the darkness within. Inside, the air was stale, but the lights flickered weakly, and the walls still held power. Daniel moved first, scanning the area, weapon raised. Riva followed behind, blade ready, each step careful, until they reached the central chamber, where the core pulsed with fading energy, and the command screen blinked in a dim rhythm. He checked the systems. Power low but stable, comes offline but restorable, med system damaged but usable. It was enough. It was a chance. They worked fast, sealing the door, setting up defenses, rebooting the med station. Riva sat on the platform as the machine scanned her, injecting basic healing compounds into her bloodstream. Her body tensed at first, then slowly relaxed. Her voice low, she whispered that it was the first time she had ever been cared for by a machine meant to heal, not harm. And Daniel smiled, a tired, quiet smile, because he knew what that meant. While she recovered, Daniel watched the monitors. One screen showed movement outside. The patrols were circling, closing in too fast, too focused. He checked the signal and found a beacon had been tripped, perhaps during their entry, or maybe from the drone earlier. Either way, they had minutes, not hours. The enemy knew they were here, and they were coming, not just a few, but a full squad, at least, maybe more. He looked at her, told her they had to prepare. She stood slowly, her body stiff, but her eyes burning with strength again. She did not ask how many, she did not ask if they would survive. She only asked where to stand and how to fight beside him, and that was enough. They moved together like old soldiers, like partners, barricading doors, setting traps, positioning weapons, crafting a plan not to win but to last. The first explosion hit the outer wall, shaking the structure. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the lights flickered again. Daniel took position at the left corridor, Riva at the right. The machines came in waves, fast, brutal, efficient metal bodies sliding through the doorways, firing without hesitation. And yet they were met with resistance, not from an army, but from two warriors who refused to fall. Daniel fired with calm precision, his shots placed carefully, always moving, always counting each shot, each second. Riva fought with blade and fury, her movements sharp and elegant, her strikes deadly. Each enemy that came close fell before they could land a blow. They moved separately, but thought as one, their minds locked in the same rhythm, the same need to protect not just themselves, but each other. Smoke filled the room. Alarms blared. The structure shook under the force of the assault. But still they stood still. They fought until their arms ached, and their lungs burned, and their bodies screamed for rest. But they did not stop, because they knew this was the stand, the place where everything would be decided. In the center of the chaos, Daniel was struck, thrown back against the wall, his head dazed, his weapon slipping from his hand. and the machines turned toward him, sensing weakness closing in for the final blow. But before they could reach him, Riva leapt into the path, her blades spinning, her body crashing into the attackers like a force of nature. She screamed in her language, a sound full of rage and fire and defiance, and her strength did not fade. Daniel pushed himself back to his feet, grabbed his weapon again, and stood beside her, their backs to each other, their eyes locked forward, enemies falling around them, metal and sparks filling the air. And for one moment in that battle, in the middle of fire and noise and fear, something unbreakable formed between them. Not just survival, not just respect, but a bond stronger than armor, stronger than blood. As the last wave fell and silence returned, the room stood still, the lights dim, the power core flickering near failure. But they were alive, both standing, both breathing, and in that moment they knew they had done more than survive. They had fought as one and changed the story of their war forever. Storm had passed, but the sky still held the color of fire and dust. The ruins stood quiet again, heavy with the weight of broken machines and fallen memories. The outpost walls were scorched, the floor covered with shards of metal and smears of oil and blood. Silence hung like smoke in the air. But inside, two figures remained standing, their bodies tired, their armor cracked, their hearts still beating strong. Daniel leaned against the remains of the control panel, his arm wrapped in cloth, his breath rough but steady, his eyes scanning the monitors one last time. Though most systems were destroyed, the emergency beacon had sent out a signal before failing, and now all they could do was wait. Either help would come or more enemies would rise from the ashes to finish what had begun. Riva sat beside the core, her eyes fixed on the pulse of its dim light. Her sword rested across her knees, her armor stained and bent, but her posture unshaken. She had been born for war, trained to fight, to kill, to never hesitate. And yet in the last few hours something had changed inside her, something small and deep that now pulled at her every thought like a voice she had never heard before. She turned her gaze toward Daniel, studied him without speaking for a long while, her mind trying to understand why a human with no orders and no gain had crossed a battlefield to carry her through fire and death, had stood beside her, had bled for her, had looked into her eyes without fear and without judgment. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, filled with something new. She asked him if he still believed it had been worth it, if saving her life had changed anything, if risking everything for one broken warrior made sense. And his answer came without delay, his words calm and true. He said, yes, because in a war built on walls and fear and silence, even one act of defiance, one choice to care, could break through the darkness and light the path ahead. Riva said nothing at first. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had ended lives, that had held blades, not hope. And for a moment, she saw them not as tools of war, but as something more, something that could still change. She reached slowly into the pouch on her belt and pulled out a symbol etched with marks from her homeworld, a small piece of her warrior rank, the last piece that still held meaning. She stood, walked toward him, and placed the symbol in his hand, her eyes fixed on his, her voice quiet but firm. She said she could not return to her people, not as she was, not with what she now understood. They would not accept a warrior who had been saved by a human, who had chosen alliance over vengeance. But she no longer cared. Her path was her own now, and she would walk it with him if he would allow it. Daniel looked at the symbol, then at her, and gave a simple nod, a gesture that carried more than words could say. And in that moment, without ceremony, without grand speeches, the two of them made a vow, a warrior's oath, not bound by blood or species or command, but by something greater, the promise to fight not just against enemies, but for something better, for those left behind, for those forgotten, for a future where strength came from unity, not fear. Time passed, and the signal was answered not by an army, but by a lone scout ship, piloted by an independent crew, who had picked up the weak transmission and come searching, expecting to find ruins. They found instead two survivors standing in the light of a broken dawn, one human, one alien, both quiet, both proud. And when asked what had happened, neither gave full answers, only that the war had taken much but not Everything Riva left her blade behind buried it deep in the ground near the outpost, a gesture not of surrender, but of change. She would fight again if needed, but not as the weapon they had created her to be, not as the shadow of fear she once cast across the battlefield. She would fight with purpose, with reason, with choice. Daniel took nothing but a map and a compass, tools not for war, but for journey, for movement, for discovering places that still held life and hope. And when they boarded the ship, they did not sit apart, but side by side, looking forward, not back. They traveled for many days across quiet space, through dust clouds and silent moons, and though they did not always speak, their presence beside each other said enough. Sometimes she would tell him stories of her world, its harsh lands, its ancient warriors, its trials and glories. Sometimes he would tell her about Earth, not the war zones, but the forests, the rain, the taste of cold water from a mountain streaming. Time they were no longer just a warrior and a soldier, but companions who had seen each other not as enemies or saviors, but as equals, each carrying a past filled with scars, but no longer weighed down by it. They helped others where they could, small colonies, lost ships, broken stations, offering strength, not just of arms but of spirit. The galaxy was still torn, still full of danger and fear, but somewhere in its endless stars, two lives moved forward together, not to erase the past but to write a new one, and in their journey they became something rare, a story whispered in corners, a legend passed in quiet circles about a powerful alien warrior who fell in battle, and the human who saved her, not for glory, not for reward, but because he saw her not as an enemy but as someone worth saving. And when people asked them who they were, where they came from, what they fought for, they never gave the same answer, but always left behind the same truth, that courage is not found in power but in choice, that trust can be born even in war, and that sometimes the strongest bond is the one forged when two souls decide to walk together through the fire and never look back. The end.